The wedding ceremony was well underway. The guests were settled in their seats, and Sarah stood beside Mark, her heart swelling with love as she gazed at him. The atmosphere was supposed to be filled with joy and happiness, but an unexpected tension was building up, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Carol, Mark's mother, had been unusually quiet, sitting in the front row with a stern look on her face. Sarah tried to focus on the moment, but she couldn't help but feel the weight of Carol's gaze. Just as the officiant began to speak, a sudden and shocking interruption pierced the air. Carol, without warning, stood up. The room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Carol's face was flushed, her hands trembling slightly as she pointed directly at Sarah. "You." Carol's voice was loud and sharp, cutting through the silence. "You stole it." The accusation hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She blinked in disbelief, unsure of what to do. The room was frozen in shock as Carol continued, her eyes narrowing with intensity. "You took my heirloom, didn't you? You thought I wouldn't notice, but I know you took it." Sarah's mind was spinning. What was Carol talking about? She had no idea what this heirloom was, and certainly had no intention of taking anything from Carol. Her face flushed with confusion and embarrassment as the guests whispered among themselves, exchanging puzzled glances. Mark, who had been standing next to her with a smile on his face just moments ago, was now visibly shocked. He turned to look at Sarah, his expression a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked from his mother to Sarah, trying to understand what was happening. But Carol was not backing down. Her eyes were locked on Sarah with a mix of anger and accusation, and she refused to look away. "You think I'm blind?" Carol snapped. "You took it from my house weeks ago, right before the wedding. I've been looking for it ever since. I know you took it." Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. She had never touched anything of Carol's, let alone stolen anything. She couldn't fathom why Carol would make such an accusation in front of everyone, on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The pressure of the moment made it hard to think clearly. The guests were watching with wide eyes, their murmurs growing louder as the situation escalated. Sarah's thoughts raced. How could Carol accuse her of something so awful, especially in front of everyone? Mark, still in shock, stepped between his mother and Sarah, trying to calm the situation. But his voice trembled slightly, and Sarah could tell he was struggling to process everything happening before them. "Mom, please, we need to talk about this later," Mark said, his tone pleading. But Carol wasn't having it. She was too focused on her belief that Sarah was the one who had stolen the heirloom. "I won't let this go," Carol continued, her voice rising. "You're not going to ruin my family's reputation like this. You took something from me, and I won't rest until I get it back." Her voice shook with anger, and Sarah's heart sank further. This wasn't just about the heirloom anymore. It felt like an attack on her very character. Mark was standing between them, trying to mediate, but Sarah could see the stress building on his face. He didn't know what to believe. His eyes flickered between his mother and his bride, torn between the two people he loved most. Sarah wanted to explain, but the words just wouldn't come. How could she prove her innocence when all eyes were on her? The tension was unbearable. Every passing second felt like an eternity. The wedding that was meant to be a day of love and happiness had turned into a nightmare. Sarah's hands were trembling, her mind racing with thoughts of how things could have gone so terribly wrong. The silence that followed Carol's accusations seemed to stretch on forever, leaving everyone wondering what would happen next. On the morning of Sarah's wedding, the sun was shining brightly, and everything seemed perfect. The air was filled with excitement, and the sound of laughter echoed from the bridal suite. Sarah stood before the mirror, looking at herself in her wedding dress for the first time. Her heart raced as she tried to take in the reality of what was about to happen. She was getting married to the love of her life, Mark. They had been planning this day for months, and it was finally here. The wedding had all the makings of a beautiful celebration, and Sarah couldn't help but smile as she imagined the future ahead of her. Surrounded by her closest friends and family, she felt the warmth of their support. Her bridesmaids, her mother, and her grandmother were all helping her get ready. They laughed, reminisced about Sarah's childhood, and told stories about her growing up. Sarah's mother, who was beaming with pride, carefully adjusted the veil in her hair. It was a moment of joy, one that she would cherish forever. While everyone was bustling around her, Sarah couldn't help but feel a little nervous. The wedding was going to be held at a beautiful garden venue, with flowers in bloom and the sound of birds chirping in the background. But in the midst of all the excitement, Sarah felt a sense of unease. There was something about Mark's mother, Carol, that made her feel uneasy. Though Sarah had always tried to be kind and understanding, Carol had never fully embraced her. Carol, Mark's mother, had been distant ever since Sarah and Mark started dating. She had always had high expectations for her son, and there had been many times when Sarah felt like she could never live up to those standards. Still, Sarah had hoped that things would improve after the wedding. She wanted to believe that Carol would eventually warm up to her and accept her as part of the family. But deep down, Sarah felt a little nervous about how the day would unfold. She hoped that the joy of the wedding would bring everyone together and help ease the tension between them. As the guests began to arrive at the wedding venue, Sarah took a deep breath and tried to calm her nerves. She couldn't wait to see Mark waiting at the altar. He had always been her rock, her partner in everything. This was their big day, the day they had both been dreaming of. But as she walked down the aisle, Sarah felt an unexpected twist in the air. Carol was seated near the front, and Sarah couldn't help but notice her tense expression. It was a sharp contrast to the joy that filled the room. Mark, standing at the altar with a big smile on his face, didn't seem to notice the tension. His eyes locked with Sarah's, and she felt her heart flutter. Everything seemed perfect, but little did she know that the perfect day was about to take an unexpected turn. The quiet tension in the air was just the beginning. What was supposed to be a beautiful moment of union was about to be shattered by something that no one could have predicted. The wedding had barely begun, and already Sarah could feel the storm on the horizon. As she reached the altar and stood next to Mark, she had no idea that everything she had hoped for was about to change in an instant. As the evening began to settle in, the mood in the wedding venue slowly shifted. The tension that had weighed heavily on everyone seemed to lift, if only slightly. Sarah and Mark stood together, their arms intertwined, ready to face the challenges ahead. But the damage had been done. Their wedding day, which was supposed to be full of happiness, had taken a turn none of them had anticipated. But now, the most important thing was to move forward. The guests had started to gather again, their whispers quieting down as Sarah and Mark rejoined the ceremony area. Carol had stepped back, giving them space, but her eyes followed them, filled with a quiet regret. She had caused a scene, and she knew it wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. The damage to the wedding had already been done, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for healing. As Sarah walked with Mark to the front once more, she felt the eyes of the guests on her. But this time, it was different. There was no judgment, no confusion. There was only understanding, the shared realization that things weren't perfect, but that they could still be made right. Sarah glanced at Mark, and in that fleeting moment, she saw the strength in his eyes, the way he was still standing by her side, despite everything that had happened. The ceremony continued, though it wasn't as grand as it was meant to be. The vows that Sarah and Mark exchanged felt deeper now, as though they held more weight than they ever could have before. They weren't just words about love and commitment. They were words of trust, of resilience, and of a future that was no longer going to be defined by a single moment. The vows were a promise that, no matter the obstacles they faced, they would stand by each other, side by side. After the vows, the guests quietly applauded, their hands coming together in soft applause. It wasn't the jubilant celebration Sarah had imagined, but it was a moment of grace, a moment where the room came together in support of the couple. It wasn't about the wedding or the party anymore. It was about Sarah and Mark's future. They had survived a storm, and now they could look forward to the calm. The reception that followed was quieter than expected, but it was filled with moments of warmth. Sarah danced with Mark, and although the laughter was soft, it was genuine. They shared a quiet moment together, swaying in each other's arms, the music creating a backdrop to their thoughts. Sarah's head rested on Mark's shoulder, and for the first time that day, she felt the peace that had eluded her for hours. She was here, in his arms, and nothing else mattered. Carol, who had remained in the background, watched the couple with a mix of guilt and relief. She knew that things would never be the same between her and Sarah. The damage had been done, and while she had apologized, she knew that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. But she also knew that, somehow, this day wasn't lost. It had been a day of challenges, but it had also been a day of understanding. Sarah and Mark had weathered the storm, and they were still standing. As the night grew darker, Sarah and Mark took a moment to step outside for a breath of fresh air. The evening sky stretched out above them, and the cool breeze brushed against their skin. They stood together in silence, watching the stars twinkle overhead. It was as if the universe was telling them that no matter how hard things had been, they were going to be okay. "I don't know what to say," Mark whispered, breaking the silence. "I'm so sorry for everything that happened today. But I'm glad you're here with me." Sarah smiled up at him, her heart swelling with affection. "I'm here, Mark, and I'm glad we're still standing together." They stood there for a few more minutes, letting the world continue around them. The wedding day hadn't gone as planned, but maybe that didn't matter. What mattered was that they had each other, and that was more than enough. The day had been filled with unexpected twists, but Sarah and Mark knew they had faced them together. And that was how they would move forward, side by side, no matter what came their way. As they returned to the reception, hand in hand, Sarah realized something important. The wedding day was just a moment in time, but what mattered most was the life they were going to build together. The love, the trust, the forgiveness. They would carry that with them, stronger than any obstacle they would face. And in the end, that was what made the day truly unforgettable. The room was still heavy with the weight of the revelation. The heirloom was found, but the tension between Sarah, Mark, and Carol had already made a mark that wouldn't be easily erased. Carol's apology felt hollow, even though Sarah could see the sincerity in her eyes. She knew the pain of being accused of something she hadn't done, and she didn't want to hold on to any anger. But it was hard. The truth was finally out, but the damage had already been done to the day that was supposed to mark the beginning of Sarah and Mark's new life together. Mark, who had stood by quietly while his mother apologized, now turned to Sarah with a look of regret in his eyes. He could see the hurt in her expression, the way the joy had been drained from her face. He reached for her hand, but Sarah hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to seem distant, but she needed time. She needed time to process everything that had happened. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," Mark said, his voice filled with sorrow. "I should have believed you from the start. I let this whole thing get out of hand." His hand gently squeezed hers, and for a moment, Sarah could feel his sincerity. She took a deep breath and nodded, trying to push down the anger that was bubbling beneath the surface. "It's not just about the accusation, Mark," she said, her voice steady but strained. "It's about trust. I thought you trusted me, and when you asked me if I took it, I felt like you doubted me. That hurt more than anything else." Mark's face softened, and he stepped closer to her. "I know, and I'm sorry. I didn't want to doubt you. But I couldn't understand why she was so certain. I should have stood up for you." Carol, still standing at the doorway, had been listening to their conversation. Her eyes were filled with regret, and she didn't know how to fix the mess she had created. She had acted out of frustration, her emotions clouding her judgment. The guilt weighed heavily on her chest, and she knew she had gone too far. She had caused Sarah pain, and she knew there was no quick way to undo that. "I'm truly sorry, Sarah," Carol said, her voice shaky. "I should never have accused you. I don't know what got into me. I was so scared of losing something so important to me, and I didn't think." Sarah met Carol's eyes, and for a moment, she saw the vulnerability in them. Carol wasn't a bad person. She was just scared and overwhelmed by the pressure of family expectations. "I understand," Sarah said quietly, her voice softening. "I know it wasn't easy for you either, but we could have figured this out without all of this." Carol nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I wish I had thought about that before I made everything worse." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Sarah wanted to be angry, but the exhaustion from everything that had happened weighed on her. Mark was right there beside her, and although the day had been tainted, she wasn't ready to let go of what they had. Their love was more important than a single accusation, more important than the embarrassment of the wedding day being overshadowed by a misunderstanding. Mark finally spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "We need to move forward, Sarah. I want us to put this behind us. This day is about us, about our future. We can't let this moment ruin everything." Sarah looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like hours, a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It wasn't the wedding day she had imagined, but maybe it didn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. They had been through a storm together, and now it was time to rebuild. "I'm ready to move forward," Sarah said, her voice more confident now. "But it's going to take time. I just need to know that you're on my side, that we're in this together." Mark's eyes softened with understanding. "I am, Sarah. I am." He wrapped his arms around her, and she leaned into him, letting the warmth of his embrace reassure her. There was still so much to work through, so many emotions to untangle, but for the first time in hours, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. They had found the truth, and now they had to rebuild the trust that had been shaken. Carol, watching from the doorway, felt the weight of the moment as well. She didn't expect Sarah to forgive her right away, but she hoped, one day, they could find common ground. The heirloom was found, the truth was revealed, and now it was time to heal. "Do you think we can still salvage the rest of the day?" Mark asked gently, breaking the silence. "We don't have to let this ruin everything." Sarah nodded, a small, genuine smile forming on her face. "We'll try, but we're starting fresh. We have each other. That's what matters most." And so, despite the confusion and the hurt, Sarah and Mark began to rebuild what had been almost lost. The day wasn't perfect, but As the search continued, Sarah and Mark felt the pressure of the situation mounting. The wedding hall, which should have been filled with joy, now felt eerily silent. The guests were all waiting, their eyes on the couple as they sifted through the venue, searching for any sign of the missing heirloom. Sarah could feel the weight of their gaze, each moment more suffocating than the last. But there was no time to dwell on the crowd. She had to focus on finding the truth. Mark walked beside her, still visibly shaken by the accusation. He had taken his mother's side at first, unsure of what to believe, but now he seemed as lost as Sarah. He wanted to trust her, he really did, but Carol's words were still echoing in his mind. It was hard to ignore the conviction in her voice, the way she had pointed at Sarah with such certainty. But Sarah wasn't giving up. She wasn't going to let Carol's false claim define her. "Sarah, I feel like we're missing something," Mark said quietly, his voice tinged with frustration. "We've checked everywhere. Where else could it be?" He glanced around, almost as if expecting the heirloom to magically appear before them. Sarah shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know. But I know one thing for sure. There's no way I took it. We need to think this through logically." Carol's obviously upset, but that doesn't mean she's right. There's something else going on here. Mark looked at her, clearly trying to keep his emotions in check. "But why would she accuse you? She's been hard on you before, but this is different. It doesn't make sense. I don't know, Mark. I really don't." Sarah paused, taking a deep breath. She tried to steady herself, to keep her thoughts organized. "But I can't let this ruin our day. It's not just about the heirloom. It's about trust. And I trust you, and I know you trust me. We'll figure this out." Mark seemed to process her words. He looked down at the floor for a moment, lost in thought. "I want to believe you," he said, almost too quietly. "I just feel so torn right now. I don't know how to fix this." Just then, Sarah's eyes caught something. There, hidden behind a decorative vase near the back of the room, was a small ornate box. It wasn't large enough to be the heirloom Carol had mentioned, but it was an odd detail that didn't belong. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Could it be something related to the heirloom? She stepped toward the box cautiously, Mark following close behind. She carefully opened it, and inside was a small velvet pouch. Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached inside, pulling out a delicate, beautifully crafted necklace. It was exactly the type of heirloom Carol had described earlier. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the missing heirloom. "Mark, look." Sarah held the necklace up for him to see, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found it." Mark's eyes widened, and a sense of disbelief crossed his face. "Where did that come from?" he asked, looking around as if expecting an answer to materialize out of thin air. Sarah frowned, studying the necklace. It was clear that it had been hidden away, carefully tucked in the box behind the vase. But why? Why had it been placed there? And if Carol had been looking for it so desperately, why hadn't she thought to check this spot? That's the heirloom," Mark said, almost as if in shock. He took a hesitant step forward and reached for the necklace, but Sarah pulled it back gently. "I don't understand, Mark. Why would Carol hide it?" Her voice was full of confusion. "It was here all along. But why would she accuse me of taking it if she knew it was here?" Mark shook his head, his expression filled with uncertainty. Maybe she didn't remember where she put it. But why accuse you? This doesn't make sense." Just then, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. Carol appeared at the doorway, her face still red with anger. When she saw the necklace in Sarah's hands, her expression faltered. For the first time, there was a flicker of guilt in her eyes. You found it," Carol said, her voice now lacking its previous strength. She took a hesitant step forward, her eyes shifting between Sarah and Mark. I didn't mean to cause all of this. She trailed off, unable to finish her sentence. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had finally found the heirloom, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an uncomfortable truth that was just starting to surface. "Carol, why would you accuse me of stealing it?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "Why wouldn't you just ask me if I had seen it?" Carol looked down at the ground, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I thought it was gone for good. And I was so upset that I let my emotions get the best of me," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know what else to do." The tension in the air was thick as Sarah stood there, her heart racing with a mixture of fear, frustration, and disbelief. She couldn't understand how everything had gotten so out of hand. The wedding, the day she had dreamed about for so long, had become a nightmare. There was no time to celebrate, no joy, only confusion and a deep sense of injustice. Mark stood beside her, torn between his love for her and his loyalty to his mother. The weight of his silence was crushing. Carol's accusations still hung in the air like a storm cloud, and the longer the situation dragged on, the more it seemed like there was no way out. Sarah wanted to scream, to make everyone understand that she wasn't guilty, but she knew that shouting wasn't going to solve anything. Instead, she took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, to think clearly. She couldn't let Carol's outburst define her. She had to focus on finding the truth. Mark, still standing beside her, had turned away from his mother to give Sarah a moment. But the look in his eyes, filled with the chaos of the moment seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. Sarah stood in front of Mark, the man she was supposed to marry that day, but his eyes, filled with doubt, made her feel as though the ground beneath her was crumbling. She had never imagined her wedding day would unfold like this. It was supposed to be a day of joy, of beginning a new chapter with the love of her life. Yet, here she was, accused of something she hadn't done, surrounded by people who had begun to question her integrity. Mark stood in silence for a few moments, his brow furrowed in deep thought. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes. He didn't want to believe his mother's accusations, but Carol's voice was so forceful, and her belief in Sarah's guilt so unwavering. Mark was caught between two people he cared about, and the strain was evident in his expression. He wasn't just dealing with the shock of the situation. He was trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't. "Mom, you need to stop," Mark finally said, turning to his mother, his voice firm but tinged with the exhaustion of the moment. "This isn't helping anyone. We need to figure out what happened, but accusing Sarah like this, it's not the way to go about it." Carol's face twisted with frustration as she crossed her arms. "You don't get it, Mark," she snapped. "This isn't just some small mistake. You can't just let it go. I've lost something precious, something that's been in our family for generations. And now, on the day of your wedding, it's gone. Someone took it, and I know it was her." The pain in Carol's voice was raw, but Sarah still couldn't understand why she was being singled out. She had never once touched anything belonging to Carol. If anything, she'd always tried to keep a respectful distance, knowing that their relationship had its share of difficulties. Sarah's heart sank further as she realized that this argument was threatening not only her wedding, but also her relationship with Mark's family. Mark rubbed his face, clearly struggling. "Mom, I don't think Sarah would do something like that," he said, trying to reason with her, though his words were less certain now. "But we need to stay calm. We need to find the heirloom first. That's what's important right now, right?" Carol, however, wasn't ready to back down. "I've already searched everywhere," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "It's gone, Mark. And the only person who had access to it was her." Sarah felt like the walls were closing in on her. She didn't know how much longer she could stand there, helpless and humiliated. She tried to stay composed, but her throat tightened with emotion. The guests were still watching, and Sarah felt the weight of their eyes, judging her, wondering if the accusations were true. "Mark, please believe me," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I didn't take anything. I would never do something like this, not to you, not to anyone." Mark was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on his mother. His mother's accusation seemed to... The tension in the room was unbearable. As Carol's harsh words echoed through the ceremony hall, it felt as though time had come to a halt. Sarah stood there, still in her wedding dress, her hands shaking at her sides. Mark was in front of her now, trying to calm his mother, but his voice lacked the authority it needed to end the confrontation. His eyes darted between Sarah and Carol, the confusion and disbelief clear on his face. "Mom, this isn't the time or place for this," Mark said, his voice strained. "We're getting married, please. Let's talk about this later." But Carol, her face flushed with anger, wasn't ready to let it go. She continued to point at Sarah, her accusation hanging in the air like a dark cloud. "You think I'm lying?" Carol demanded, her voice shaking with frustration. "I've searched for weeks, and now it's gone on the day of the wedding. This is no coincidence." Her eyes narrowed as she glared at Sarah, whose chest tightened with each word. She wanted to scream, to explain herself, but nothing seemed to make sense anymore. The guests, once joyful and excited, were now murmuring among themselves, exchanging confused glances. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, and the weight of their stares was more than she could bear. She had always dreamed of this day, the happiest day of her life, but now it felt like the moment was slipping through her fingers. Mark turned to Sarah, his face a mix of concern and disbelief. "Sarah, did you take anything from my mom?" His question was soft, almost hesitant, but it hit Sarah like a slap in the face. She had never stolen anything in her life, let alone from Carol, but hearing the doubt in Mark's voice twisted something inside her. "I swear, I didn't take anything," Sarah said, her voice trembling. She looked into Mark's eyes, trying to make him understand the truth. "I don't know what she's talking about. I've never even seen this heirloom she's talking about." Carol was still fuming, not ready to back down. "I know you took it," she shouted again. "I've been looking for it everywhere. And now you're here, pretending like you didn't do anything. This isn't just a misunderstanding. You've ruined everything." Her words stung, and Sarah felt her heart break. She had never intended to cause any harm, let alone destroy the wedding she and Mark had worked so hard to plan. Mark stepped back, running his hand through his hair, trying to process everything. "Mom, this is crazy. We need to find out what's going on," he said, his voice firm now, trying to assert control over the situation. The guests were silent, unsure of how to react to the drama unfolding before them. The atmosphere had shifted from excitement to tension in a matter of moments. The wedding, which should have been filled with love and happiness, was now tainted by accusations and confusion. Sarah felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. Every second felt like an eternity, and the longer Carol kept pointing her finger at her, the more it seemed like the truth would never be heard. Mark's uncertainty was a knife in her heart. How could he question her like this? Did he think she was capable of something so horrible? Despite the heartbreak, Sarah stood her ground. She wasn't going to let Carol ruin everything for her. "Mark, you know me. You know I would never do something like this," she said, her voice stronger now, though it shook with emotion. "We can find out what happened, but please, please don't believe this lie." Carol was still adamant, her anger showing no signs of slowing down. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Sarah's dream wedding was slipping further and further away. All she wanted was to marry Mark, to start their life together. But now, it seemed like nothing would ever be the same again. Mark's face twisted in frustration. He wanted to believe Sarah, but Carol was his mother, and the doubts were eating away at him. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to start. The air was thick with confusion and hurt, and Sarah felt her heart break a little more with every passing moment.